let me tell you a bit about Dr. Hong. You probably, as all internet savvy people, many of you probably clicked on the hyperlink on the announcement for her talk, but in case you didn't, a few things. So as I said, she's a professor of US history at Occidental. This is her sabbatical year, so she's a fellow at UCLA in their Asian American Studies Center. She did her undergraduate in history at Yale and then a PhD in history at Harvard. Her first book came out a couple of years ago called Opening the Gates to Asia, a Trans-Pacific History of How America Repealed Asian Exclusion. And she's now working on a book for Oxford University Press in which she's exploring how post-1965 Asian immigration has changed US politics and institutions, and in particular American evangelicalism. And she's looking at this intersection of the rise of the religious right and this growing population of Asian Americans and how both of those are affecting our country. So we are excited to have her here. Not only can you tell from that work and her future publication that she's a significant scholar. She's also on the editorial board of the Journal of American History, but we also appreciate, I'm sure we'll see displayed today, of the intersection between history and public history and being a public intellectual. So she's also been a consultant for PBS documentaries, including the award-winning documentary on Asian Americans, and speaks on NPR, and she's written for the LA Times and the Washington Post and Christianity Today. So covering a wide range of communities and conversations, but we are excited to have her here today to speak to us on Beyond Black and White Racial Reconciliation After 1992. So join me in welcoming Dr. Hong.
Thank you all for masking. This allows me to take off my mask. So that was a very kind introduction. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you, Heather and Felicia, for the invitation and just for all the folks who helped organize the visit. I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to share. So I think my talk will probably run a little shorter than the allotted time period. So my hope is that a lot of what I say or some of what I say might generate some questions and thoughts. Occidental is also a liberal arts college, so I'm very used to, even though I've been away from the classroom for a while because I'm on leave this year, I welcome questions. I also realize that for many of you students, you were not alive in 1992, and I was reminded of this recently when I was, so I've been doing a lot of research on Asian American evangelicals, and so I had just finished writing a chapter about 1992 and Asian Americans in Intervarsity Christian Fellowship, if any of you are familiar with that parachurch organization. And I was thinking about how Intervarsity became a site where Asian Americans engaged racial reconciliation, in some cases for the first time. And so I'll touch on some of that research today. But as I was doing the research, I was talking to a student and I said, "When were you born?" And then I realized that a lot of this, right, a lot of what I'm writing about in this chapter, to me, it's more recent history. I mean, for many US historians, the 1990s is still kind of history, and so there aren't as many folks writing about this very recent history. But I know for many of you, it's not something that you were alive for. So I do want to make sure I give enough background as well. So I invite your questions and your thoughts, and just thank you for being here today. So in 10 days, April 29th, we will mark the 30th anniversary of when the Los Angeles uprisings, or riots, began in South Los Angeles. And let me just say, the nomenclature of 1992 is very challenging, which is probably why I just usually use the word Los Angeles 1992. So some of the different terms used to denote this event, I think LA riots is probably the one that most people are familiar with. I think that's the one that most journalists use. It's kind of in the media. Historians generally use the term uprisings or rebellions because riots there's so much kind of loaded in that term, but uprisings or rebellions, it suggests or it recognizes that for many folks who participated in the events following April 29, 1992, for them it really was an act of rebellion, an act to say that living conditions, economic conditions were not okay. Police brutality was not okay, right? So I think for historians, these are the terms we usually prefer. In other situations, you might hear people call it the Los Angeles civil unrest. I guess that's a very kind of neutral way of talking about this event. And then for Korean Americans, they call it 사이구, so 429, denoting April 29th. And that term is used, I hear it everywhere, and in Korean newspapers, that's how it's referred to. In many ways, the fact that people generally understand what that means, 사이구, 429, it tells us just how important and how significant this moment really was for Korean American communities as well. So the uprisings were a transformative event featuring 6 days of racial upheaval that destroyed neighborhoods and killed more than 50 people after the acquittal of 5 Los Angeles police officers who were caught on video savagely beating Rodney King, a black man. And I think most people who watch anything about 1992 have seen the grainy footage, right? This is 92, this is not like this was like literally someone holding like a camcorder, right? This is not like a phone. But those videos were widely viewed. They were played on news over and over and over. And I think the general consensus is that, especially if you watch the video, the beating was gratuitous. There was no need for that level of brutality. I'm sure some of you have seen images of Rodney King after the beating. He did survive, but he suffered massive health problems for years after. And I think a lot of the kind of anger, disappointment came, because remember, so the beating actually happened March 3rd, 1991, but the uprisings didn't begin until the following year, because again, as I mentioned, the 5 police officers were acquitted, and a lot of the controversy had to do with where the court case was tried, where the jury members were drawn from, right? Because in America, the idea is you are, supposed to be judged by a jury of your peers. So in theory, people from the neighborhood, right, in which you belong, the neighborhood in which the event happened. But because of a lot of concern about what would happen in South Los Angeles if the trial were held there, the case was actually moved to Simi Valley, California, which I don't know if many of you know where Simi Valley is. Simi Valley is the home of the Reagan Library. In the 1990s, it was an incredibly white suburb of Los Angeles. And so when you think about who the jury was made up of, the jury was all white plus 1 Filipino American and 1 Latino American. And so even from the get-go, right, that whole story of kind of who was making the decision about whether these LA police officers should be punished for their actions, right, it was contentious throughout the entire process, but the actual case took more than a year to play out. But another event, and here I'll just write, these are just images. When I think about, I was living in New Jersey at the time. I was also in middle school, so I had a vague notion of what was going on, mostly mediated through the Korean newspapers. But in US mainstream media, the way that most Americans came to understand what happened in LA was through images like these, right? It's hell, looting, fire and fury, right? So it was a very kind of sensationalized, right? The coverage was very sensationalized, both locally in Los Angeles, Southern California, as well as nationally. And we can talk more about the role that media played in this whole event. But another event happened that month, March 1991, that also really shaped the conversation in ways that have oftentimes been overlooked and forgotten. And this was the murder of 15-year-old Latasha Harlins, a 15-year-old black girl, by Korean storekeeper Sun Ja-do in South Los Angeles. And this, right, kind of generated a kind of black Korean conflict narrative in conversations leading up to the violence and then during the violence itself. And so 2 things I wanted to talk about today. First, I wanted to give some context to the Latasha Harlins case and the role that these kind of black Korean conflict narratives played in 1992. In particular, how did the Latasha Harlins case shape community responses to the acquittal of LAPD after the beating of Rodney King? And how did the black Korean conflict narratives serve to obscure or complicate realities of anti-black police brutality and larger structures of white supremacy, which formed the waters in which all of this took place? Second, lesser known to most Americans, I wanted to talk about how the 1992 uprisings ignited a movement toward racial reconciliation in white evangelical circles. So this is a perfect place for me to talk about this. This is something I've been thinking about for a very long time. Calls for Black and white Christians to forge meaningful relationships and connect across bitter racial divides became mainstream, widely accepted as never before. But my question, something I've been thinking about in my research and just in life, what did these conversations about racial reconciliation mean? What do they mean for non-white, non-Black communities? So in particular, I've looked at Asian American communities, but Latinx communities also fit very much into this narrative. Because on the ground, when you actually look at who was involved in 1992, Korean storekeepers obviously were part of the conversation, but so were a lot of Latino residents who lived in South Los Angeles as well. So they actually made up a big part of who was involved as well, although they often get erased from the conversation too. So 1992 Los Angeles has often been called the first truly, quote, multi-ethnic or multiracial, quote, riot. So what did this mean in practice for the Asian American and Latinx Christians who also occupied and shared these white evangelical spaces where people were talking about racial reconciliation in new ways after 1992? So let me just start with the Latasha Harlins case. On March 16, 1991, Harlins, a 15-year-old Black girl from South Central, walked into Empire Liquor Market in Delhi, grabbed a bottle of orange juice that cost $1.79 and put it in her backpack. A confrontation ensued where Sinjadu, a Korean-born merchant who had immigrated to the United States about a decade before, accused Harlins of stealing the orange juice. Latasha actually had $2 in her hand. Du grabbed Latasha's sweater, Latasha punched Du in the face and headed for the door. Du picked up a handgun and fired a shot into the back of Latasha's head. This was also caught on video. Again, very grainy video, befitting 1991, right, technology. Police later confirmed that there was no attempt at shoplifting. And in fact, as I mentioned, Latasha had $2 in her hand. During the trial and kind of the court case that ensued, Sinjadu testified on her own behalf. The defense claimed that the shooting was in self-defense and that she believed her life was in danger. In particular, her defense team emphasized the statistics. So the number of Korean storekeepers who had been killed in Los Angeles in recent times. So in the 1980s, about 19 Korean storekeepers were killed in LA, in most cases by African Americans during a robbery in progress. In 1991 alone, Koreatown was a site of 48 murders and 2,500 robberies, so this became a big part of the defense's case. And Black Korean conflict was not just an LA story from the 1970s and 80s. By 1991, it was actually a national narrative visible in popular culture. I'll come back to this one. Again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with any of these kind of pieces of pop culture. So there were two really big examples of where you saw Black Korean conflict really visible in national pop culture. So on the left, you'll see a frame or a character from Spike Lee, his movie Do the Right Thing that came out in the late 1980s. So a minor character in that movie was a store owner named Sonny, played by Steve Park, who later was in Living Color. He was a comedian in the 90s. And he has a few scenes throughout the movie, usually as the butt of some joke. And at the end, he makes a little speech where he says to some of the Black residents, he says, quote, I know white, I Black, you, me, same. And so there's a kind of a way or an attempt to kind of appeal to this common kind of language of people of color. And everyone there kind of around him laughs at him as to dismiss him, right? So there are these moments from the film. And on the right, you have a very famous song called Black Korea, which was performed by an artist named Ice Cube. I'm sorry, do any of you actually know who these people are? Maybe you do. I think, I'm always like, usually when I'm in the classroom, I'm like, do you all know what I'm talking about? So that song came out in 1990. The lyrics are right there. And the lyrics warn that if Korean storekeepers don't show respect to Black customers, their businesses would be burned down. And so these were already conversations that were out there in popular culture. In New York City, these tensions had already escalated. So even just a year before, in 1990, local Black communities in a neighborhood in Brooklyn had staged an 8-month boycott. It's called the Big Apple boycott. After a physical altercation between a Black customer, so a Haitian-born Black customer, and a Korean storekeeper who accused the customer of stealing. And so an 8-month boycott played out. It eventually did end without violence breaking out. But I mean, scholars have actually asked questions about like, why did violence not happen in New York City while it did happen in Los Angeles? There's all these political scientists who've asked these questions. And I think one of the big differences, two big differences I remember, scholars citing, something about, number one, the politics, kind of the kind of local city politics of Los Angeles versus New York City is one. And then another one is just the role of the media. So in the New York City context, local media coverage tended to be favorable to the Korean store owner and the Korean storekeeper. Whereas in Los Angeles, the opposite was really true. So what a lot of media scholars have done is to kind of trace the role of newspapers like the Los Angeles Times and local news coverage to think about kind of what role did they play in constructing narratives. In the LA case, Koreans were generally portrayed in very unfavorable ways, and they were demonized as taken away from Black communities. And again, this is true for both, right, New York City and Los Angeles, but the media really did construct different narratives. And so that's another big area that media scholars have done a lot of work to try to understand LA versus New York City. And in fact, when you think about this kind of Black Korean conflict narrative, again, it doesn't come from nowhere. I think in reading about the Sun Ja-do case, Sun Ja-do, I believe she was in her 40s or 50s by then. I mean, I think there were interviews with her where she was asked about her views of her Black customers. And her family had not owned Empire Liquor for that long before this altercation occurred or before she shot Latasha Harlins. There had been, so in these interviews, she had expressed very anti-Black attitudes, right? Things that you might expect about how Black customers were rude, how they were prone to shoplift, and how she had to watch them more carefully. And in fact, this mirrors a lot of the conversation among Black customers who really hated, and actually just, you could even look at the Ice Cube lyrics, the idea that Korean storekeepers were just kind of watching, right? They were staring because they believed that every Black customer was going to try to steal something. And so there is, right, this kind of anti-Blackness when Sun Ja-do is interviewed. There's also, right, the Doos, they had trouble. So the store, like I said, they hadn't owned it for that long. But a year earlier, a drive-by shooting had happened outside the store. Some witnesses ran for cover, and they came into the store, and then Mr. Do, Sun Ja-do's husband, had made them leave because he didn't want to get involved in what was happening. One of the local Black men he forced out was later shot and killed, so that created a lot of animosity among, right, local residents who didn't like how the Doos kind of didn't protect local residents. The Doos also had been threatened by a local gang, the Main Street Crips, shortly before the shooting, because their son had agreed to testify against two gang members who were accused of stealing things in the store. And so it got so bad that they actually tried to sell the store, and it sat on the market for several months. And this was the context in which this altercation or this shooting happened in March 1991. The reason I include some of this context is that I think it actually all matters. And I think honestly the best book on this case is by a historian named Brenda Stevenson. It's called The Contested Case, or The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots. And this book, Brenda Stevenson's a really well-known historian of Black women. And her argument generally is that the erasure of Latasha Harlins from public mainstream narratives of 1992 is part of a broader erasure of women, and especially Black women, from histories of anti-Black violence. And I think there are probably lots of parallels to today when we think about whose names are remembered, whose names aren't. And so in this book, she's trying to kind of redirect the conversation to think about Black women and women in general. And she's also interested in thinking about how racism and patriarchy intersect. And in particular, she argues that racist violence is not the exclusive province of men, right? So these are often highly gendered narratives. Like the narrative of Rodney King is a highly gendered narrative, if you think about it. But she talks about, in this book, the violence that women can do to other women. And not simply the violence that Sun Ja-do did to Latasha Harlins, but also in the middle, the violence of Judge Joyce Carlin who's actually the judge who, against the advice of many, suspended the jail sentence that Sinjadu was given by the jury. So ultimately, Sinjadu, she was found guilty, and she was supposed to serve a 10-year jail sentence. But Joyce Carlin, in the middle, she argued, this is not the kind of person you send to jail. She's not likely to commit a crime like this again. These were extenuating circumstances. So she suspended the jail sentence, and so Sinjadu did not serve jail time. She paid for the funeral costs, and then she paid a $500 fine, and I believe she had a 5-year probation period of community service. And this is what outraged residents so much. And so when folks talk about kind of the miscarriage of justice that happened in the case of Latasha Harlins and the price of a life, scholars will often bring in another case that happens a few years later, also in Los Angeles. It's the 1996 shooting of 17-year-old Brenda Hughes, a Black teenager in Highland Park, which is actually really close to where I live, really close to where Occidental, it's one neighborhood over. So Hughes died November 1996 when the owner of the grocery, Jo Won Kim, a man, fired into the car in which she was riding with several friends. He had confronted several of the boys that she was with in the car. He believed they had tried to steal a can of beer, so a similar kind of shoplifting, right, accusation. He shot into the car and she was killed. Kim pled not guilty, but eventually he was convicted. And one of the big differences is that he actually went to jail. And so one of the things that some scholars talk about is that actually matters, right? So the fact that Kim goes to jail and serves jail time for the shooting of Brenda Hughes is in part why violence does not break out, because folks are closely watching this case. As you can imagine, just a few years after 1992, folks are watching this case very carefully, but it doesn't kind of erupt in the kind of violence you saw in 92. From today's vantage point of 2022, I mean, I think today we might look back and say, why only carceral strategies, right? I think today when folks talk about, you know, are the alternatives to this kind of reliance on jail time? I think there are, right, from an abolitionist point of view. But for 1991, 1992, and 1996, these were the options that were available. And so I think just the idea was folks should serve jail time for the crimes that they commit. And so you see a kind of difference in outcomes. In this book, historian Stevenson, she, more closely than many historians, she traces the structural and systemic histories of white supremacy and racial capitalism that created the setting in which 1991 and 1992 took place. And here, this is what, if any of you take US history classes, I mean, I teach the second half of the US history survey. I mean, this is like all I do, right? We talk about structural and systemic histories. You talk about federal housing policies beginning in the New Deal through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, GI Bill. Who can get mortgages, who can't? So it's the thinking about how policies, federal policies, lending practices, discriminatory bank lending, all of these things, redlining, how they all together create the, quote, inner city that emerges by the 1960s. Like, these things did not just happen, right? So historians really like to talk about and focus on the policies, the structures, the racism built into the systems and structures that created places like South Los Angeles. So Brenda Stevenson spends a lot of time talking about those structures, talking about the creation of South Los Angeles. Why is it that you have so many African Americans living in one particular neighborhood that's underserved? In the parts that are probably lesser known, she devotes whole chapters to Sinjadu, talking about how do you get Koreans? Why are there so many Korean store owners in South Los Angeles by 1992? And here she actually starts with the immigration history. She starts with the history of Sinjadu in Korea, the reasons that they decided to immigrate to the United States, the labor market, the kind of discriminatory hiring practices that made it hard for them to get jobs otherwise, and the different kind of racisms and the structural constraints that led them to open stores in places like South Los Angeles. Who was willing to sell stores to them? What kind of stores could they actually afford? And what did this mean, right, in practice as things played out? Because as I mentioned, or I'm not sure if I mentioned, but by the early 1990s, Koreans actually owned more than 30% of independent liquor stores throughout Southern California. So it wasn't a small number. Some had bought their stores from white owners who were leaving the area, so kind of white flight kind of narrative. But some also bought from Black store owners who saw the value of their businesses diminished when local liquor laws changed to allow greater competition. And again, these are the things that historians really dig into, because the argument we make is that it actually matters, right? We have these kind of grand narratives, but in order to really understand what happened in 1992, in 1991, you actually have to understand the local conditions of Los Angeles. There's so many things I could say. This is actually a meme now, so if you're on Twitter, you can actually you can just hashtag rooftop Koreans. So during the actual, quote, riots, during the violence that followed April 29th, and the reason I think why it was such a big milestone, traumatic moment for a lot of Korean store owners, about 40 to 50%, depending on who you talk to, the estimates, about 40 to 50% of the businesses that were targeted or destroyed during the violence were Korean-owned. And these spanned South Los Angeles and what is now parts of Koreatown, right? So it's actually a big area. And during this period, LAPD left, right? And I think some folks might know this story better than others. People are like, where is LAPD? And so you had all these Korean store owners calling the LAPD, right? Calling. People they had kind of donated money to, thought they had a good relationship with, and just people never came. Police never came. And so in Korea, there's still, even today, a mandatory military service. I believe it's 18 months now. If you ever watch K-dramas, the actors are always leaving to go to the military. So that was still the case in the 80s. And so most of the Korean store owners, the men, were immigrants, and most of them had actually served in the military, so they knew how to use weapons. And so you saw these kind of images, and these were the images that LA Times and other local media loved to kind of splash onto the front page, because it was just such an odd image for most people. Rooftop Koreans. So Koreans they basically started to protect themselves. And kind of stood on top of their businesses with guns, right? So these are the images you see. What often gets erased from these narratives as well, these kind of media narratives, is what happened at the end of the 6 days. And so at the end of the 6 days, scholars write about this, but I feel like nobody really knows about this other than scholars and maybe the people who were there. There were actually a series of marches that were attended by lots of different people, white folks, black folks, Korean folks, Latinx folks, right? Who actually, right, they marched through Koreatown. This is a picture from May 2nd, 1992, calling for peace and unity. And so these kinds of images often get erased, as I mentioned, but the conversation within the Korean American community in particular really centered around generational differences. Because one of the big complaints, or one of the big kind of realizations for many Korean store owners was that they really had no political power. They had no political access. They didn't have linguistic, English language access. And so there wasn't really a lot of they didn't have a lot of political cachet. And so during this period, a lot of them were silenced by the media coverage. Because again, if you're a local news reporter for Fox or ABC, you're not gonna try to interview someone who doesn't speak English. And so a lot of those folks just kind of didn't participate in that conversation until a little later, when you had kind of a second generation Korean Americans, folks who spoke English fluently, emerge and kind of tried to voice, right, tried to say or articulate something of what was happening among the Korean American communities. So there were generational differences as well. And so all these images, right, that often get, I think, erased from kind of larger media narratives of what happened. So what's really interesting about 1992 is that it had the unexpected consequence to launch what many would call a mainstream white evangelical movement for racial reconciliation. And kind of one big milestone that marked the beginning of this was Bill Pinnell's The Coming Race Wars, A Cry for Reconciliation. This was published by Zondervan in 1993. I don't know if many of you know who Dr. Pinnell is. He was a longtime professor at Fuller. He's still alive. I'm interviewing him for my book, so I just saw him a few weeks ago. He has just an amazing story, an amazing life. He's well respected, kind of, trusted by many different folks. And he wrote this book and it became a bestseller, kind of unexpectedly. Even he was like, I was surprised. I was surprised white folks read this. Because the book it doesn't mince words, right? So in the book, Bill Pinnell criticizes white evangelicals for embracing what he calls white supremacy and abandoning the multiracial city for the white suburbs. So it's really a book that critiques the suburbanization of American evangelicalism and just the segregation, kind of how white folks were just leaving the city. And his argument was white Christians needed to take, quote, courageous and extraordinary steps to avoid more violence, like the violence that had happened in Los Angeles. The book's also really interesting, especially for my research. It's one of the very few books, evangelical books, that actually talk about Asian Americans and Latinx communities as part of this kind of complex multiracial history of Los Angeles. And I think the reason, I did ask him this, the reason I think he's able to kind of see these communities is that he's really focused on the city. He's really focused on the neighborhoods themselves. Also, having been at Fuller for so long, Dr. Pinnell taught a lot of kind of folks from local Asian American and Latinx churches. And so he was familiar with these networks, as well as kind of Black Christian networks. So some white evangelicals seemed to heed his call. In 1994, white and Black Pentecostals met at a really well-publicized conference in Memphis. And their goal was to overcome past racial disagreements and discuss a future reconciliation strategy. So how to move together right forward. The following year, and this is huge, I don't know if folks know how big this is. In 1995, the Southern Baptist Convention, which still, even today, is the nation's largest Protestant denomination. It's the biggest. It's evangelical, it's Protestant. It has a strange relationship to the NAE, but it is Protestant, it's evangelical. So the SBC issued a long-awaited apology for supporting chattel slavery. And it passed a resolution declaring its commitment to racial reconciliation. And the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, it's a denomination that actually formed in 1845 because of slavery. So it kind of broke from the American Baptist Convention over the issue of whether slaveholders can serve as missionaries. The SBC said yes, the ABC said no. And so the SBC came out and created its own, separate denomination. So 150 years after its founding, it issued a statement apologizing to, quote, all African Americans for condoning and or perpetuating individual and systemic racism in our lifetime. So Christianity Today ranked it one of the biggest evangelical news stories of the year. Kind of big waves, big waves. People have been waiting for a very long time. I could say more about that and kind of what the purpose of this resolution was and what it actually begot. But at the time, it was a huge kind of milestone, and people were like, okay, racial reconciliation, it's real this time. Of course, you had critics, and in Christianity Today, I don't know if any of you have access to the archives. I think you probably do through Westmont. Even just searching through the archives is utterly fascinating. They go back many, many decades. You can search Billy Graham from the 1950s. So in the 1990s, you had a series of articles kind of critiquing this kind of white discourse, this white evangelical discourse of racial reconciliation. And a lot of the critics were Black folks, Latinx folks, some Asian American folks. Another kind of big moment in this racial reconciliation movement, this is the one that scholars always harp on because it's just so interesting, but it really was a phenomenon. It was a phenomenon. Millions of men participated in something called the Promise Keepers movement. How many of you actually heard of the Promise Keepers movement? Yeah, so they actually tried to revive, so I think they had a meeting last year. I don't know how many people actually went, but they've revived themselves. But in the 1990s, they were huge. Millions of men, white men, Black men, some Asian American men, Latinx men, Latino men, came together at these big kind of stadium events. And in the 1990s, so it's generally speaking, when scholars write about it today, they often talk about it in terms of misogyny, sexism, because it's limited to men. And the idea was men are the leaders, men are the keepers. And so when you think about renewing your faith, you should focus on the men. But there was a big kind of milestone moment where the Promise Keepers, they made racial reconciliation a very key point of their platform. And so this really pushed the limits for some evangelical men, particularly white evangelical men, who were used to more, they were used to kind of going to church in a more kind of white space. And they were used to evangelical churches that kind of sidestepped questions of race in the name of spiritual unity. Because again, that's not a new thing. That's a discourse that goes back to the 60s. It goes back even further. But at these rallies, Promise Keeper leaders would call on thousands of men of diverse backgrounds to hug, to embrace, to pray for a man of a different race. And so there are all these images, I should have found an image. There are all these images in not just Christianity Today and Christian media, but like in mainstream US media, newspapers, these images of like white and black men like sobbing, embracing each other. It was a huge cultural phenomenon. And in fact, if you look at what Promise Keepers talked about, it was also the resurgence of an approach that was embraced by figures like white evangelist Billy Graham during the Civil Rights era. So again, historians like to think about connections, continuities between the past and the present. So there is a continuity here, because under the direction of Promise Keeper leaders, white men embraced their black brothers, tears flowed, right? Mutual and repentance, racial healing. But as a member of the National Black Evangelical Association asked during a Promise Keeper leader's visit to one of their meetings, he asked Bill McCartney, who was the founder, this Colorado football coach who founded Promise Keepers, he asked Bill McCartney, what is Promise Keepers going to say about the anti-affirmative action atmosphere in this country? This is like in the 90s when affirmative action, Proposition 209, how many of you know what Proposition 209 is? Oh, I always ask this when I teach it in my class. Proposition 209, it's the proposition in 1996 that eliminated the use of affirmative action at all higher education, public universities in California. So if you're in California, I feel like you should just know this, so know this. Proposition 209, okay? It's important. But I totally get it. Most of my students are like, I don't know what that is either. And also, I'm in California too, Occidental's in California, and a lot of them had applied to UCs, right? So that's a really important proposition. There was actually a proposition on the ballot in 2020 to overturn it. It did not go through. I think it was Prop 16 was the effort to overturn and to reinstate the use of affirmative action. I digress. But in the 1990s, that was a huge kind of sticking point. It was a policy debate. This is also the period of Prop 187. Prop 187 was, in the 90s, it was an attempt by the California governor to strip undocumented migrants of all rights. Okay, that was also happening. The mid-90s are just, I don't know if many of you, again, none of you was alive, many of you were not alive, but the mid-1990s are just fascinating and also sobering, right? Because you have debates over welfare, affirmative action, undocumented migrants, the border. 1996 was like, I don't know, okay? And that was during the Clinton administration, okay? So it's a bipartisan conversation. So, a member of the National Black Evangelical Association asks Bill McCartney, what is Promise Keepers going to do about affirmative action? What is it going to do about these policies that are threatening my community? And Bill McCartney didn't know what to say. Because again, the Promise Keepers wasn't interested in policy, structures, or systems, right? They were interested in individual reconciliation. Black men, white men, Asian men, Latino men coming together, repenting, okay, crying, and praying together. They were not interested in taking that beyond, right, beyond the individual. And so this kind of harkens back to folks like Billy Graham and other mainstream white evangelicals from the 60s who during the civil rights movement argued very vehemently that racism was a, quote, heart problem. It's a heart problem that could be solved through the evangelism of souls, right? So how do you solve racism? You evangelize people, you save their souls, and they repent of their sins of racism. But Billy Graham did not support legislation. For him, because racism was a problem of the soul, it wasn't about the ballot box, it wasn't about Congress, it wasn't about legislation. And so Promise Keepers followed in the same tradition of individualistic solutions, non-structural ways of thinking about race, racism, and racial reconciliation. And this is very much at odds with Black evangelicals like Dr. Bill Pinnell, like folks like John Perkins, who I think some of you might have heard of, John Perkins, Tom Skinner. In the 60s and 70s, they basically said the opposite. They basically said, Perkins argued that Christians, it wasn't just about making friends of a different race, that's not enough. But that was the first step, John Perkins argued. The first step is for different, people of different races to come together, create relationships, create friendships, and then together they needed to work to resist unequal structures. So these friendships, cross-racial friendships, were supposed to be the vehicles of societal transformation. So the idea was together, these friends, these cross-racial friendships and relationships, these folks would together resist laws, policies, practices that oppressed people of color, right? So it wasn't enough just to be friends with somebody else. The next step was to take action together for societal transformation. And so Black evangelical voices remain the loudest and most trenchant critics, right, of an individual racial reconciliation. I included the one on the right, racial reconciliation after the hugs what, because this was really interesting. It ran in Christianity Today, which even today is kind of like the mouthpiece for a lot of white evangelicalism. Andre Tapia was a Latino journalist, one of the very few employed by Christianity Today in the 90s. And in 1997, he argued, you know what? The next step for racial reconciliation is to address the social and political issues that hurt communities of color. Very famously, he asked, quote, "Will the white promise keeper wanting to hug me with reconciling fervor, has that person ever considered how the immigration policies they support terrorize Latinos, even those legally present in the United States? Or have they asked how welfare reform laws newly enacted by Congress have put many Latinos on the street?" And so you already see these kind of critiques. I mean, there are critiques throughout, okay? There are critiques throughout. But more and more you see diverse folks making these critiques. And here, right, in my own research, I look at kind of how Asian Americans enter this conversation. Particularly, this is Peter Cha. He's a professor at TED's Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago. And you know, Urbana, which is, I don't know if many of you have been to Urbana, it's a missions conference that Intervarsity Christian Fellowship hosts every few years. It's their kind of flagship conference. Urbana has been kind of at the forefront of a lot of these conversations. And so you have Korean Americans, you have different kind of Latino Americans, African Americans coming together and talking about these issues from the main stage. And so Asian Americans also tried to engage these questions, particularly around 1992 and the presence of Koreans in the 1992 events. So by the late 1990s, most white conservative evangelicals were starting to lose interest in racial reconciliation. Gone too far, right? It's over, it's over. But then this book came out. This is by, how many of you have read this book? Divided by Faith. Okay. So this is kind of one of the very few academic books that get read outside of academia. So this book was published in 2000 by sociologists and white evangelical Christians, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. And they did basically a whole series of surveys, nationwide surveys, telephone surveys, interviews. And what they argued was, you know, white evangelicals, they see racism as an individual problem rather than a systemic or structural problem. So they put evidence behind what a lot of folks had already been critiquing for quite some time. And the argument they made based on these findings is that this individualistic view of racism and racial reconciliation actually perpetuated racial division. And so this message, this book, it got read by many moderate and more liberal evangelicals. And so you saw in some kind of segments of evangelicalism a move toward kind of embracing racial reconciliation, not just as a fad, but as something that actually mattered. And again, it also kind of launches what folks have called a racial justice genre. Intervarsity Press, some of you might have read some of the books published by Intervarsity Press, they have a whole page called Racial Justice. That didn't exist really before 2000. And so one of the arguments historians make is that this book helped launch that as an entire genre unto itself. And the idea was you can't just preach reconciliation anymore, you have to actually talk about justice. Because justice gets at the more societal and systemic dimensions that really matter. The book also sparked institutional change. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Evangelical Covenant Church. So leaders of the ECC revised their denominational goals. They actually rewrote some of their bylaws based on this book. And by the early 2000s, there seemed to be a consensus among white evangelicals, everyone from John Piper to Bill Hybels, okay? There was general consensus that racial diversity was important and racism is a problem. Right, this seemed to be something that more and more people embraced. In 2012, the Southern Baptist Convention elected its first black president in more than 150 years. Right, so folks thought, again, there was a kind of upward movement or movement forward. I know some of you in this room have read The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. He also has like a Substack, which I read pretty regularly. He's also really active on Twitter, as many of you know. And Jamar Tithi has argued that it's really the rise of Black Lives Matter after the deaths of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and Michael Brown in 2014. This is what really tested white evangelicals' commitments to racial reconciliation and justice. And Jamar Tithi argues that it's actually these deaths and Black Lives Matter that marked the beginning of the end of what he calls the, quote, mainstream white racial reconciliation movement. And you can see kind of moments, in this kind of story. I look at, in 2015, Intervarsity platformed Michelle Higgins, who's a Black Lives Matter activist, on the main stage of Urbana, so its missions conference. And there was a huge outcry after that happened. Some donors pulled out, lots of, right? And it kind of showed, it made the New York Times, and this kind of showed how contentious and divisive calls to racial justice still remained, right? More than 2 decades after 1992, right? So there's movement forward, there's movement backward, right? So it's an ongoing kind of story. And of course, the 2016 election of Donald Trump, right, in which 81% of white evangelicals supported the candidate, while most Black, Asian, and Latinx Christians did not, reflected deep polarization on questions of race. And of course, more recently, or in the past few years, evangelical attacks on critical race theory, or CRT, however you want to define it, offer a new articulation of the racial polarization within the evangelical movement. And so the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution critiquing CRT in 2019. There's an ongoing conversation within that denomination. More recently, Cru, if folks know Cru, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ, right, had its own kind of internal brouhaha, had to shutter its ministry focused on race and ethnicity after a small contingent of white staff claimed that CRT and focusing on race encouraged disunity and missional drift from the core goal of evangelism. And that happened in the last 2 years, actually happened last year. So all indications suggest that white evangelicals have become more, not less, polarized on questions of racism and race relations. So to me, the last thing I'll just kind of end with is, one thing I think, so what, if anything, has changed? One thing I've been thinking a lot about in my own work is, one thing that has changed is who makes the category of evangelicals. And of course, there's also ex-evangelicals. There's lots of different categories of folks leaving evangelicalism. So in 1992, as I mentioned, Bill Pinnell was one of the very few Black or white evangelical voices to talk about non-white, non-Black folks, so Asian Americans and Latinx folks, as part of kind of these stories of race in America and evangelicalism. This phenomenon is really interesting. In the past 10 years, the number of Asian American and also Latinx folks who now lead evangelical organizations is actually really interesting. And so I've been following this. This is not the main kind of focus of my book, because again, I'm a historian. I focus on way back, the 1990s, or the 70s, or the 60s. But this has been really interesting. Over the past 10 years, there have been all these Asian American, usually men, usually Korean American men, who have come to lead really storied organizations. I don't know if any of you know the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals. That's like the umbrella group for evangelicals. So in 2020, they elected Walter Kim, a second-generation Korean American, the first Asian American and first non-white president of the NAE. And more recently, he told the New York Times, this is a piece from a few months ago, he told the New York Times that his first priority as head of the NAE was, quote, grappling with the issue of racial justice and reconciliation, right? So these are conversations that folks are having. It's also interesting that this is happening right now during the time of anti-Asian violence, which we can talk about as well, where that fits into a lot of these dynamics. So in my work, I'm thinking about, to what extent does it matter to have more people of color in leadership? To what extent can they actually effect change? To what extent do entrenched power structures make it really difficult to actually effect real institutional change? These are things I'm thinking about in my work. But this whole phenomenon is fascinating, and I think it'll probably continue as time goes on and as the church, the evangelical church, becomes more and more diverse, particularly with immigrants and the kids of immigrants, post-65 folks, Asian Americans and Latinx folks. And so these are things I'm thinking about a lot in my work, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts from your perspectives. And so I'll stop here and pause for questions. Thank you. I can recap questions too. If folks want to yell out, I can recap them from here. Yes. Okay, so the question was, to what extent do I see the kind of rise of more diverse leadership within evangelical organizations as progress? Well, first I do want to say, yeah, it was I misspoke. The whole 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. Historians love to say that history is not teleological, it's not linear. So in terms of thinking about, is there like one path that everyone has to follow toward enlightenment, I wouldn't say that. When you think about racism in America, race in US history, it's really just messy, right? Like I teach Reconstruction, Reconstruction is a time of immense, quote, progress, but even those terms, historians get very kind of uncomfortable with those terms, but there is movement, I think that the way that I'm framing my history of Asian American evangelicals in particular, and I think this is true to some extent, really for any people of color, and Dr. Purnell has agreed with me, so I'm okay, I'm more confident saying this out loud. I think the history of non-white folks, people of color in white evangelical spaces, is a history of tokenization. And that's just the bottom line. And that'll be in the introduction of my book, Tokenism and Tokenization. It's like trophies. The question that I ask, though, so I take that as a starting point. I take that as a starting point as a matter of fact. But the question I'm interested in is, within these kind of tokenized positions, kind of figurehead positions, how have Asian Americans and other people of color actually exerted a lot more influence and power? How have they actually been able to transform institutions from within? Because I do think I do think it's possible. I think it's asking a lot, right, to ask people who are put in these positions with no real power or authority. And by the way, I'm not saying that these names, these organizations that now have Asian American heads, I'm not saying that they're all figureheads. But I think historically, when you think about the inclusion of people of color in these white spaces, and this isn't unique to evangelicalism, I think this is true in America, history of tokenization. But within those positions, folks sometimes are able to make real change. And I'll use Intervarsity Christian Fellowship as an example. So like in the 80s, I don't know how many of you know Intervarsity or are familiar with Intervarsity, folks who were in it. Intervarsity has long been seen as kind of on the cutting edge of everything race-related and multi-ethnicity related. They're light years ahead of Cru. I was part of Cru in college, but so I can say that maybe. But even with Intervarsity, the reason they had to think about racial diversity from early on is because they had people like Tom Skinner in the 1970s who actually railed against white supremacy on the main stage of Urbana. But they allowed it. Intervarsity allowed that to happen. But in the 80s and 90s, Intervarsity tried really hard to create a multi-ethnic organization, largely in response to just who was coming to their meetings. I was just speaking with someone in the late 80s. I was talking at Berkeley. UC Berkeley, by the late 80s, UC Berkeley's Intervarsity campus chapter was majority Asian American. And that's not common for every, chapter in America. But Intervarsity just had all these non-white people coming, a lot of people of color coming to their meetings, students, and they were like, who are these people? How are we going to serve them, right? What does it mean for our organization? And so Intervarsity did a lot of soul searching, and they brought on Asian American staff, Latino staff, Black staff into a room, and they had a committee that was advising the main kind of board of trustees, the people with real power. And they kind of revamped their mission statement, they kind of revamped their budget, and they began to put aside money to support staff of color who wanted to join Intervarsity in the 1990s. So really, before people even talked in these terms, kind of institutional, systemic, right, Intervarsity was doing a lot of that already by the late 80s, 90s. It was a growing process, so it wasn't like uncontested. There was a lot of internal dissension. When Intervarsity created ethnic-specific ministries, there was a big hullabaloo, right? So Black campus ministries, Asian American ministries. In my chapter, I focus on the creation of Asian American ministries in the 1990s, and there were lots of folks within Intervarsity, longtime staff, white staff in particular, who argued that that's creating disunity, right? So there's a lot of that kind of language happening. But for Asian American staff, there was a group of folks who said, you know what, Asian Americans that are coming to campus or coming to college, they don't understand where they fit. I feel like people could still say that now in 2022. But people were saying this in the 1980s, 1990s, because Asian Americans were coming to college campuses. They were the fastest growing racial group on college campuses, bar none, in the 80s, 90s. And like they were coming and they didn't really understand if they were white, if they were not white, what it meant to be Asian American. And then events like 1992 Los Angeles created more urgency for folks to kind of understand where they fit. And all the affirmative action debates, which are not new, but had a different kind of tenor in the 80s and 90s. Asian Americans were like on the cover of Time magazine, America's Whiz Kids, and people are like, but I'm not that, right? So what are Asian Americans? Are they model minorities? Are they foreigners? I mean, do people even think they're American? Right, so that's all these internal conversations. The people driving those conversations were people of color, and I think Intervarsity, when it created these committees in the 80s and 90s to create a more multi-ethnic organization, clearly there was buy-in from people on top. But in terms of shaping what the kind of structures and what the vision looked like, a lot of it was, that labor was done by people of color, staff of color, people like Jeanette Yep in the 1980s and 90s. And I've interviewed a bunch of these folks, and I mean, it's hard to do that kind of work now. I can't even imagine what it was like to do that work in the 80s and 90s. And so Intervarsity, is one of these kind of examples of an organization where, it kind of like, there was a lot of internal contest over whether to move in this direction, but it was really the people of color within the organization that drove it. That story doesn't necessarily play out. I mean, there's a lot of turmoil in the early 2000s, which I cover in my chapter with Intervarsity, but I think that's one example, really, of where you can see people of color actually making change. And so those are the kind of stories I'm interested in for my book, because again, even if people put you in positions that are meant to be kind of more token or symbolic, from within those positions, like, can you affect real change? Again, it's hard, it's a high bar, it's asking a lot, but I've seen folks do it. And so my hope is that, with all these kind of diverse leaders coming to power, that you might see more attention, more conversations, meaningful conversations about what racial justice can look like. I do hope that. I also think, and this is the last thing I'll say, part of the reason my book is so challenging is that Asian Americans often fit very uneasily in these categories. Are Asians white? Are Asians black? They're neither, right? And so there's a way in which Asian Americans often, in some of these organizations, Asian Americans get elected leaders before black folks do. Because the fear is that black folks might actually push and ask for too much. But Asian Americans, right? Maybe they're white adjacent, maybe they'll be a little more pliable. So there are a lot of those racial assumptions going on too. So I think Asian Americans are a really interesting case, which is why I think the book that I'm writing has just been really fascinating to research. But I think as time goes on, particularly during this moment, during the pandemic, I think a lot of Asian American folks have been more politicized to understand that actually Asian Americans are people of color. They face racism historically, but also in the present. And so I'm hoping that there will be more solidarity born out of this moment. Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's something I'm thinking about throughout the entire book. Because gender is so, I don't know if many of you have read Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumais. I'm sure many of you have. If you're on Twitter, it's like everywhere. And I think that book is about white evangelicalism very explicitly. But these are still in some cases, the spaces, the evangelical spaces that Asian Americans come to engage in the 90s and onward are these spaces. And so when you think about how central gender and sexuality have been to shaping modern evangelicalism, so even just two examples, number one is the debate over women's ordination. I mean, one of the really interesting things I found is that so many Asian American women join parachurch groups like Intervarsity and Crew because their churches will not let them get ordained, or their churches might officially, or their denominations might officially let them get ordained, but how many churches actually hire a main woman pastor? Very, very few. How many Chinese immigrant churches are going to hire a woman pastor? Almost none. Even today, it's really hard. And so a number of the Asian American women staff I interviewed said that. They said that they wanted to pursue full-time ministry. Parachurch groups were one of the only ways that they could do that. It was one of the only ways people would actually recognize them in ministry. But even then, a lot of women, they don't get asked to speak at retreats, they don't get asked to speak, right? So there's still gender dynamics playing out throughout these folks' careers. I thought that was really interesting. So the whole question of ordination, I think, is really big. And in terms of the racial reconciliation debates and just these public conversations generally, I remember actually there was a webinar with Kristen Dumais, or she did a podcast with, I think it's an Asian American Christian podcast, and I think she had been talking to a lot of different folks, and when you think about kind of who gets recognized within white evangelicalism, it's white men, white women, and then it's like black men, Asian American men, Latino men, and then women. Asian American women, black women, right? So there's still patriarchy at work, so that's again where racism and patriarchy, right? The intersectionality, you actually have to think about these things in tandem. So Asian American men, for example, it's easier for them to get exposure in white evangelical spaces. And I mean, that list I showed earlier is a prime example, right? And you have denominations like the Presbyterian Church of America elect an Asian American leader. They don't ordain women, so of course it's going to be a man. And so I think men get advantage, even men of color have greater advantages than women of color in these same spaces. And so I see this playing out in situation after situation. And so that's something I'm very attuned to in the book. Yeah, and I could say more, but maybe I'll stop there. Oh, yes.
Do you see something like a kind of recurrence of this evangelical urge for reconciliation in the midst of social change? Because I'm thinking maybe I remember something similar happening every 30 years, it seems. So it's happening now, and then the civil rights movement, and then you kind of have some stuff going on in the 1930s, and the further back you go, you kind of see these cycles. Could you talk more about what makes the 1990s different from what I see as a kind of recurrence of this urge towards reconciliation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the question is, what makes the 1990s moment different from earlier kind of moments of civil rights protest and these kind of seemingly every 30-year cycles of civil rights movements in the United States and across US history? Which I think is true. There is a kind of cyclical kind of tenor. I think the 1990s are different primarily because of how multiracial the country was even by that point. And I don't think the multiracial nature of America was evenly distributed. So places like Los Angeles were already way more multiracial. Actually, that goes all the way back to literally, it goes back to statehood in the 1850s. California was already multiracial in a way that lots of other places in the country were not. So you already had big Chinese and Japanese populations, for example. Obviously you had Mexicans because California used to be Mexico. Indigenous peoples, right? So California was already, the demographics were already different historically, but by the 90s, a lot more of the country looked like Los Angeles. And a lot of the sites that I look at in particular, so college campuses as I mentioned, Asian Americans were the fastest growing racial group on college campuses across the country. And so a lot of these spaces were just multiracial in new ways. It's also, the 1990s are also a particular moment when a lot of the children of post-65 immigrants are now growing up and going to college. There's also a phenomenon in the 1990s called the silent exodus, which is really, if you ask an Asian American Christian about the silent exodus, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. In 1996, Helen Lee, who is, I think, one of the only Asian American writers at Christianity Today, she wrote an article in 96 called The Silent Exodus, which basically talked about the phenomenon of second-generation Asian Americans leaving the church forever because they found the immigrant churches they grew up in out of touch, stifling, unable to meet their needs, unable to understand kind of their own distinct generational identity. Because again, I'm a US-born second-generation Korean American, and I think very differently from my parents. I think very differently from my in-laws, who are also Korean, they're immigrants. It's a different kind of mentality. And so there was this wave of Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, so largely East Asian Americans leaving the immigrant church. And the question that Helen Lee asked is, where did they go? Some of them went to multi-ethnic churches. Some of them went to kind of white majority churches. And then in the 1990s, you had churches, multi-ethnic and Asian American churches being created. Churches like New Song in Orange County. I don't know if any of you know that church, created by Dave Gibbons. Thank you. I mean, so that whole, and I'm writing a chapter on that. There are these churches that are created for kind of the children of immigrants, Asian American, but also Latino immigrants. And it's a whole phenomenon. So that's happening in the 1990s. So I think that is what makes this conversation different. But I don't think most people at the time understood how to make sense of it. It was just that people recognized, oh, look, there are these people that I don't really know how to place, these non-white, non-black communities, folks who have immigrant families, immigrant histories, who are very close to their immigrant histories, right? One generation removed, maybe. And that whole, situation, and these folks are in evangelical spaces. They're joining Intervarsity, they're joining Cru, they're joining like different denominational churches. They're going to Fuller Seminary, they're like flooding in, right? And so the question for a lot of administrators at these Christian colleges, seminaries, is what do you do with this community? Like, how do you understand them? They're not international students. But then if they're not international, because people understood international students, right? There have been missionary networks in Asia for centuries, sending students to Wheaton College, Westmont, different parts, right? Occidental when it was Presbyterian. But, I think in the 90s, in the 80s, 90s, administrators were like, okay, they're not international students, but then what are they? Like, I don't understand. What does it mean to be an Asian American? And I think people were just trying to figure that out. And so I think that was a more prominent conversation in the 90s, driven in large part by Asian Americans themselves, who are now part of Intervarsity, who are actually writing books and writing about these things. So I think that is partly what changed. And the last thing is just what I said earlier. The 1990s I don't know if many of you know this, the 1990s are incredibly important, not just to national history, but to California history. The 1990s, the whole debate over undocumented migrants, Prop 187, can undocumented migrants access education? Can they access healthcare? Can they access just rights, right? That debate in the 90s is what historians argue basically drove Latino voters into the Democratic Party. So like in the 90s, most Asian Americans in California by 1992 voted Republican. By 2000, majority of them voted Democrat. And you saw a similar kind of wave. You saw a similar movement among Latino voters. That's more mixed nowadays. Latino voters, Latinx voters are actually very complicated now. But the 90s were incredibly important for political realignment. That's really where you saw the creation of kind of people of color, voters of color flocking to the Democratic Party. And a lot of it had to do with the welfare debates, the immigration debates, and these affirmative action debates of the 1990s. So if any of you are interested in that history, I'd really encourage you to at least Google it, because it's really fascinating, even if you just read a few articles. As someone who lives in California, it's actually part of your history. It's part of why things are the way they are in this state. Thanks for the question. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about Asian American, African American relationships in Los Angeles since 1992. So your talk began in LA, Koreatown, South Central, and so on in 1992, and then from there took us maybe
Yeah, so the question is, since 1992, kind of what has been the landscape of Black Asian American relations, and particularly the role of churches, right, in that conversation in urban Los Angeles? So this is something I've been thinking a lot about and talking to folks about, and there's a number of 30th anniversary commemorations happening. There's one hosted by the Korean Consulate this Saturday, actually, and then Princeton Seminary is actually hosting one next month. It's co-sponsored by the Center for Asian American Christianity and the Center for Black Studies, the Black Church. So I would encourage you to check that out if you're interested. They're doing watch parties nationally. I'll be speaking along with, there's 4 Asian American speakers and 4 African American speakers. So I think that there were efforts. I mean, the aftermath of 1992, there was a really ineffective city-driven project. I think it's called Renew Los Angeles. That was just money was pumped into that project generally to rebuild the areas that had been, the stores or the neighborhoods that had been destroyed during the violence. Renew Los Angeles, yeah, that was, I think, generally speaking, scholars would argue it just, the money, nobody knows where the money went. It was incredibly unsuccessful in terms of actually reaching the people who needed the funds to rebuild their businesses and to rebuild the economy. So Los Angeles as a city didn't do a very good job, I think, on the city level to rebuild those neighborhoods. In private circles, so Black and Korean churches, there were a number of events. You know, there were kind of, I've interviewed a number of folks, Black pastors, some Korean organizers. There were efforts, and you know, there were organizations. Even the Black Korean Alliance, you know, that organization had existed as far back as the 1980s. It disbanded around the time of the LA uprisings, and it never kind of recaptured. It was never able to come back together in the same way. So there were these kind of pre-existing coalitions where Black and particularly Korean folks got together and talked. But I mean, in terms of long-lasting change, there was a lot of cosmetic efforts, and there were a lot of kind of, like I said, joint choirs and like cultural dinners and public events. But a lot of the activists I've talked to say that, and there were some scholarship funds, you know, hosted by Korean churches who did, you know, tried to kind of ease tensions with the Black community by doing like scholarship drives. And there were all these different events, as I said. But the consensus for many folks I talked to seemed to be that a lot of these efforts weren't really, they were not institutional. They didn't actually create kind of institutional change. It was kind of more cosmetic, and it was more fleeting. That's not to say that individual pastors and faith leaders didn't actually get together and create, you know, friendships, relationships were born out of these events. And I know there are folks who are doing good work in Los Angeles today with Black and Korean communities and Asian American communities generally, like FACE. But yeah, I can't actually point to a particular example where I think a collaboration or a response actually generated long-term change, which actually saddens me to say, but you know, I'm still interviewing folks, so maybe there'll be other examples. I think among secular folks there were some, right? Because there were a lot of Korean American organizers, the second-gen English-speaking folks, who really did work really hard to try to partner with Black communities and to create real change. And so I think a lot of that work happened outside the churches, is my understanding. Oh yeah, so the question was, what parallels can we draw between the 1992 violence and then the anti-Asian violence of the pandemic? I mean, I think it's tricky. Maybe one of the things that I'll say is, I think both events have created, as I suggested earlier, they have politicized more Asian American Christians. So in 1992, I think many first-generation Koreans realized that they actually couldn't just stay by themselves, right? Because it was a very insular community for many different reasons. A lot of it had to do with language and then political access. But I think many folks at that time realized that they couldn't just kind of stay in their own communities anymore, because at the end of the day, they were part of a city and they needed to actually create political partnerships. They needed to, advocate for themselves. Different circumstances, though, in those situations. Today, I think, as I mentioned, something I've been really interested in actually is I've been working with some Korean American Christians in the PCUSA, which is a mainline denomination. And I've been doing some work with the Korean caucus of that denomination, which is largely first-generation pastors, so immigrant pastors, but also second-gen English-speaking folks. And more of them have expressed an interest in kind of pan-Asian or Asian-American organizing than ever before. And I think there have even been polls done during the pandemic where Korean Americans are 30% more likely to identify as Asian American than they were before the pandemic. So there's a way in which these events can create greater solidarity with other, maybe, people of color, and in particular, maybe other Asian Americans. I think that's probably true also for other non-Korean Asian American groups. Just the idea that, and this I think is different from 1992, but today, when you think about who's been targeted by anti-Asian violence, it's literally everyone who looks vaguely Asian. So a Burmese family at Sam's Club in Texas, Filipino woman is the one who got kicked in the head 125 times in Yonkers, New York, Chinese Americans, Thai Americans, Korean Americans. I mean, it really is anyone who can vaguely pass as Asian. In fact, I really remember there was a really egregious incident in Eagle Rock, Los Angeles, my neighborhood of Los Angeles, where a Latina woman, a grandmother in her 60s, was attacked and beaten on a Los Angeles bus by someone who thought that she was Asian American, but she was literally a Mexican American woman. And this happened, this happened in the first year of the pandemic. So literally, when you think about kind of why these moments can generate greater solidarity, I think there is a greater recognition that, in some ways, the people who are perpetrating the violence, they don't care. They don't really distinguish between one Asian, right? So I think it's a sense in which all people of color can be targets. And I know there's also been a conversation among people of color about who is actually perpetrating most of the violence. And I think, a lot of scholars have done work on this, and it's still 85% white folks who are committing this anti-Asian violence. And so I think these conversations are complicated, just like 1992 was really complicated, right? When you talk about Black-Asian relations, my head wants to explode, because it's actually much more nuanced than most people recognize. And I think for folks who are familiar with 1992, all you need to do is say Latasha Harlins, and then it's silence, because people don't want to touch that, because it's such a difficult conversation to have. And there's so much pain and anger, and rightfully so. And so it's a really, these are really challenging conversations. And that's, when I alluded earlier to Intervarsity Christian Fellowship, being very cutting edge on race, they had their own kind of internal challenge in the early 2000s, where they couldn't kind of negotiate between, in a conflict between a Chinese American woman and a Black American man. It's I think that's where a lot of folks just kind of don't know what to do. And I think maybe but that needs to be part of the conversation, right? Because it's both thinking about how people of color all, right, can share some solidarity in that they are people of color who are racialized by white supremacy. But white supremacy pits people of color against each other. That's inherent to what white supremacy does. It divides and it conquers. And so what are ways that folks can recognize that, yeah, there is internal conflict, white supremacy divides and conquers, but how do we acknowledge, talk about, and directly address these internal divisions in a way that allows us to meaningfully partner and move forward? And that's so hard, to be very honest. But I would like to think that Christian communities are the first place it can happen in ways that maybe would be hard to happen somewhere else. So my hope is that, people of faith are willing to have those conversations, more receptive to those conversations, because there is a shared bedrock of faith. That's my hope anyway. So I guess we'll see as time goes on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong.
Thank you.